All right, thank you, Amy. Whenever I come to modern day debate, I've done so many of these capitalism versus socialism debate. I'm
You
very
move in with your
interested at what
question.
Dr. Burgis has to say to my questions tonight because in a dozen debate I've done here on that subject, I've never really heard a satisfactory answer by socialist or leftist in general, and even statist as a whole. Uh, to the two big problems of socialism. The two big problems that are automatically solved by capitalism. So much so that when we adhered to capitalism, we didn't even have an understanding of these problems. We didn't adhere to capitalism to solve these problems, but capitalism has accidentally solved them. And since then, we have not thought of even a theoretical way of managing society that would be equal in quality to what capitalism provides, precisely because of these two families of problems. The first family of problem I want to talk about is the lack of a eugenic system to arrange the forces of nature with the forces of the economic world so that they are compatible, so that they work towards sustainability, so that they don't drive toward dependence, and so that they don't drive toward unsustainability or draining of a system. So, how do eugenic pressures work in a capitalist system, a true capitalist? I'm not talking about a capitalist system like we have today in America or in Canada. That is not a full capitalist system. There is too much of a social net which keeps people from dying. But in a true capitalist system in which there would be no support for people who cannot sustain themselves, they would end up dying. And this would make any sort of lifestyle that is not sustainable across generation to progressively disappear from society rather than encumber society with a set of needs that can only pump away energy from society. Of course, the classical examples are social welfare. Of course, if you give social welfare, that's free money. If people on social welfare can reproduce, you end up with a next generation of more people who had the genes that were not eugenically fit to work in the free market, and you end up with a bigger cost for your social welfare. There is no end to this in a socialist system until the complete crash of civilization. And you will only have to count on the managing elite to decide exactly when that happens and exactly just how much poverty do we have to go through before that system stops. In capitalism, the people who gather resources are able to buy land and they're able to raise bigger families than the people who don't have as much resources. And there's no social welfare net that will catch people who are too much at the bottom. Therefore, capitalist societies are eugenically stable and they in fact improve with time, whereas socialist societies are eugenically unstable. They get worse and they create more dependence up to the point where it's not sustainable anymore. And I would say, don't think of just social welfare as being the problem here. Basically, all sorts of services that the state offers are part of this family of problems. Think about public school. It used to be that there was a strong control of parental influence onto the child, and through tradition, religion, and community, the child would get raised mostly by cultural signals that would encourage the reproductivity of the child, the adherence to a heterosexual lifestyle that was healthy for them and that was allowing them to have babies, and and all of the information that a father and a mother can share with children. In a socialist system, we have already seen our public school within a few decades of really forced public school experimentation. We have seen already our system of education converge away from the natural, where some teachers, some librarians in this system, some director of the school want to push these ideas that are anti-reproductive, anti-natalist, onto children, and sometimes at great cost to their emotional well-being and to their possibility of reproducing later. That's another way in which the state, as an unnatural entity, comes in and imposes a regime that is unsustainable. Because the more the state pushes for non-reproductive, anti-natalist lifestyles, the more you have people who are simply draining away from heterosexual families. They are occupying a place in society, but they are not giving life back. They are not producing more babies for the next generation. This contingent of society in a capitalist system with no state services can live to the extent that they can gather useful work in the free market, and they can provide a good service to the rest of society. So I'm not saying here that all anti-natalists are barred from a capitalist society. But what's good about the capitalist society is it has a proper rewarding system for these people rather than rewarding everything and assuming that every human being is deserving of a minimal set of entitlements that he can steal from others if he needs to, which is what socialism is. Now, going back, so we've talked about eugenics. That is the big family of problems that relate to the natural relationship with the economic sector. And there's also forms of economic eugenics happening at the corporate level. The fact that corporations can outcompete one another, that is a great thing of capitalism. But a second big family of problems that I would like to see Dr. Burgis solve tonight, because I have great respect for the guy. I've seen a lot of his debates. I think he's a great guy, and I really can't wait to see what he has to tell me tonight. The second family of problem is the problem of allocation of resources. Socialism, being inherently authoritarian, no matter the form of the authority and the distributedness of it, socialism ends up being a centralized system at some level. Some level is making the decisions for the rest of society, even if that level is ultimately a proxy of a democratic vote, for example. But somewhere in a socialist society, and there are different flavors of it, but somewhere power is concentrated. And where power is concentrated, there is a place for failure. Because power means deciding for others what happens to them without paying the consequences. One example of how capitalism undoes allocation of resources is how a capitalist can invest in companies by means of production. If that person produces something that people desire a lot and are able to pay for, that person gets rewarded, becomes a millionaire, perhaps a billionaire, and we would want exactly that kind of person who has escalated the wealth scale from 0 to 1 billion. We want this kind of person to be able to decide what happens with society tomorrow. They are better at making decisions on what people will eventually need. They are better predictor because they have passed through a test, the test of success on the capitalist market, which has proven that they had a feature to their decision making that was particularly fit to know what people would eventually want. In socialism, there is a management class, but it hasn't been properly selected for the purpose of being good at deciding where society is headed. So what do you end up with? Well, perhaps your manager on a given day is a good one, but perhaps it's a bad one. And there is no system to exclude the bad ones and keep only the good ones. Pretty much, it is an arbitrary system of power that will lead a manager to acquire power. And when I say manager, I mean at all levels of the corporate world, up to in the equivalent of a CEO. So in capitalism, the people who have been rewarded have been selected, and they are able to invest money in research and development, for example, where a socialist country would fail. A socialist country would have difficulty assessing what is the next iPhone. Is it worth investing in a potential next iPhone? Of course, they could make good bets on their R&D bets, but they wouldn't have been demonstrated systematically to be good enough to win those bets and to have an accruing amount of capital to make those bets. That is why capitalism beats socialism.
Thank you so very much, Dr. JF, for your opening statement. And we're going to hand it over to Dr. Ben for your up to 10-minute opening statement. The floor is all yours.
All right. Thank you, Amy, and thank you, JF, for agreeing to this debate. That was a fascinating opening that covered a lot of territory and a lot of things that I'm sure that we're going to get into in the back and forth. I often think that part of the purpose of a debate is to clarify the sort of most fundamental things that you disagree on, right? So Elizabeth Brunig says half the point of a debate is to get the other person to tell you what they really think, which I take as being, among other things, a way of saying that that oftentimes it's very instructive to argue with people who disagree with you on absolutely basic questions of value, because as you go through the disagreement, those value divergences become obvious, and so anybody who agrees with you about the value questions can see where it leads and pull back from it if they don't like it. So, for example, I completely concur with the empirical premise that not having capitalism in its rawest form, having capitalism where some of the roughest edges have been sanded off by labor unions, by a regulatory state, by ordinary working class people having some power, does differ from capitalism in its rawest form, in the sense that desperate people, are less likely to starve to death in the streets. I think that is absolutely empirically true. I think there's a huge burden of proof that has to be discharged that this will lead to even slightly bad consequences, never mind a consequence that would be so bad that it would justify letting that happen. But in any case, I think because you start with that empirical agreement, then we can have the more we could really dig into the more interesting disagreement about, is it good to just let people starve to death in the streets? Is it in fact vastly civilizationally better from any perspective of anything remotely approaching normal human values to not let that happen? As far as a lot of the specific challenges that were raised about arbitrary power, about whether redistribution is stealing, about economic innovation, for example, about iPhones, I'm sure we're going to get into all of those in the open discussion. But right now, I want to pull back a little bit and talk about the basics of my position, because we've heard a little bit about why JF doesn't like socialism, whatever exactly that means to him. But since I'm going to be arguing for socialism, I want to say first what that means to me, and second, why, what the case for it is, right, before we get into the problems. So socialism in the broadest sense means the social ownership of the economic engine of society, what's usually called the means of production, though we can treat that as a useful shorthand for the means of production, distribution, exchange, extraction, transportation, finance, all of that. Under capitalism, which we agree we have a version of right now, not as bad as it could be, but a version of it, that means the means of production are in private hands. Businesses and their assets are, for the most part, not entirely, but the sort of dominant mode within the economy, either owned by individual capitalists or bits and pieces of them are owned by stockholders. Either way, the effect is to divide society into a class of workers who don't own their means of production and a class of owners who live off the work of others. Socialists object to that arrangement for a lot of reasons. I'll get into one in just a moment, but first I just want to note that social ownership can mean a lot of different things. I want to be as specific as possible, and I think when we address JF's challenges, it's going to be good to have started out being specific. So I think the best model, so if you look at, for example, David Schweikart's book, After Capitalism, or the piece that Mike Beggs just wrote in Catalyst about this, is a combination of state ownership and worker ownership. So, for example, a local coffee shop with 10 employees could be reorganized as a cooperative, where everyone who worked there for long enough to be a full member had a democratic vote in running the place, but they'd still be competing in the market with other cooperative coffee shops. But social priorities like healthcare and education should be taken out of the market entirely and planned for the public good. I would argue that we have tons of evidence from really existing models in democratic Western nations that these sectors actually work much better that way. To the extent that you do need things that are sort of gestured at in some of that opening statement, like price signals and firm failure, to make the economic machine work efficiently, you can do that. But in this kind of model, there is a considerably expanded role for the public sector, not just in running social priorities like healthcare and education, but in directing what socialists sometimes call the commanding heights of the economy. Think energy, broadband, and crucially finance, since if you want an economy with a stable dominance by worker and community-owned firms, you want the model for starting new ones to be grants from nationalized banks rather than having to drum up money from wealthy investors. Okay, so that's the model. But why would anybody want it? What's wrong with the arrangement that we have right now? Now, I would say a lot of things. We have people living in real poverty, not starving to death in the streets. We have had that much progress at least, but real poverty and misery in some of the wealthiest societies in the history of the world. We have a psychotic level of economic inequality where the average CEO, for example, makes not tens or dozens, but hundreds of times the salary of the average worker. And we have social despair fueling some things like the opioid epidemic. And we have people living on the streets while other people crisscross the world on private jets. We have a foreign policy influenced less by the preferences of ordinary voters, the preferences of shareholders at Lockheed Martin. I could go on and on. But I want to, just for the last couple of minutes of my opening, go to a slightly more abstract level than that, because I'm sure we're going to be in the weeds of a lot of those issues over the course of the discussion today. But what I want to think about for a moment is what's the principle that tells us in the broadest sense how society should be organized? And to start thinking about that, I would say, well, think about why nearly everyone who, is not a sociopath or is not just sort of pretending, trollishly pretending to think things that they don't, finds racial discrimination, for example, deeply objectionable. Or why nearly everyone in 2023, whenever they think of capitalism and socialism, at least agrees that feudalism is a grotesque and unacceptable way to organize a society. Is some people's life chances, the resources that are allocated to them, the amount of power they have over their individual lives and the collective lives that we all live as a society are different depending on whether they're black or white in the racial discrimination case, whether they're born a lord or a serf in the feudalism case. That's morally indefensible. And similar considerations should apply to different people having different life chances, different levels of ability to experience their full potential, different amounts of power, and so on, depending on whether they're born into a rich family or a poor one. Same principle applies. The fancy name for this idea, this is from the philosopher G.A. Cohen, is luck egalitarianism. And very roughly, this is my way of putting it, but the core of the idea comes from Cohen, is that a set of social institutions are unjust to the extent that they lead to some people having more than others due to factors outside of their control. You don't get to decide whether you're black or white. You don't get to decide whether you're born into a rich family or a poor one. And you could say, hey, some people climb up the ladder of economic mobility due to their own talents, and that's absolutely true. But those talents, even in the cases where it is that and not dumb luck, those talents are themselves unevenly distributed. That's true of cognitive talents no less than physical ones. If I'd done nothing all day, every day from a young age, but shoot hoops in the backyard, I would still not have a future in the NBA. And similarly, whether you're good at school, whether you're good at schmoozing and climbing career ladders, all of the things that go into climbing the ladder in a corporate capitalist society are themselves unevenly distributed, and it's fundamentally unjust, all else being equal, for different people to have different levels of ability to fulfill their potential, have different levels of ability to lead a stable and dignified life, all of those things because of factors outside of their control. Now, the fact that societies, I know I'm coming up to the end, but I just want to say this, that societies are more just the more they correct for inequalities, does not mean that the right choice is always to correct for every inequality. Sometimes you might have to allow some degree of inequality, not CEOs making hundreds of times the salary of workers, but some degree of inequality for the sake of providing incentives that you need to keep the economic engine running. And that's fine. You can take that into account. Sometimes you have to balance distributive justice against other important values. But I do think that inequalities linked to factors outside of our control should be considered guilty until proven innocent. That's why the end of feudalism in Europe, or the end of Jim Crow in America, or according to me at least, not JF, the creation of the modern welfare state so poor kids didn't starve to death in the street, were all massive victories for basic justice. And it's also why anyone who looks at the dismal capitalist status quo around us and says, yeah, that's it, this is the best we can possibly do as a species, I don't think is being serious about this.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.